Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm stepping in for Beth Heaton as host for today. I'm very excited for the show that we're going to be able to bring to you. We've got a really wonderful two-part conversation in the later part of the show to talk a little bit about the International Baccalaureate Program, or the IB curriculum. I don't know if that's something that many of our listeners are familiar with. I think sometimes if you know it fairly well. And if you don't know it, it's completely new to you. So we're going to explore that in some great detail in the later parts of our show. But before that, we want to acknowledge the fact that it is April 27th, which means May 1st is right around the corner, which for those of you who are seniors or parents of seniors means you have come to the end of what has been a long decision-making process to identify exactly which college you'll be attending in the fall. Now, we want to talk a little bit about this from a college finance perspective today. And joining me to have that conversation is my colleague, a college finance expert here with College Coach, Wally Boudet. Hey, Wally, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks.
Glad to have you. Now, there are so many things that families have been doing. They've been looking at financial aid packages. They've been unpacking the, structure of those packages. What are the loans? What are the grants? Hopefully, as they are listening to this today, they've made a decision and decided to deposit at a particular school, right? There still is some time on the clock, but I think it's about time to start, yeah, we're probably not going to get any new information in the next 3 days. And so as families cross this finish line, is there a sense of like, okay, we're done. There's nothing left for us to focus on, or are there particular things that you especially would encourage them to pay attention to?
Well, hopefully not the former, because while it would be great to, enjoy graduation and take the rest of the summer off, it's unrealistic because there are still things to do, still things that need to be monitored throughout the whole summer. So yeah, I mean, very important items that need to be taken into accounted for to make sure that families, not just students, but families are not left scrambling when August, September comes about.
And I think some of this stuff on the admission side is fairly front of mind for the students, right? So things like a housing packet, who's going to be my roommate, where am I going to live? Like that's something that I think students are very actively concerned with. But I get the sense from you that there are a number of things that might not be front of mind, but still are very important for students to think about as they're heading into the fall. Let's see if we can put together a sort of to-do list of things that families can keep an eye out for. What would you start with? What tends to be pretty high on that list or pretty common for most families sending a student off to college for the first time in the fall?
Well, it's interesting because I polled my teammates, many of whom have recent college admits and many of whom are about to have college admits. And number one was that students and families need to constantly check their portal. When they were admitted to the school, chances are the school set up a secure online site for them to access information. Email is probably out, but hey, students mostly didn't read emails anyway. So yeah, they've got to check their portal because they've got to make sure that everything's done. With the financial aid, they've got to review the required documentation, master promissory notes. There's required loan counseling. For some scholarships, there may actually be, and this is maybe more of an admissions issue, there may be the need to submit additional documentation, such as post-graduation transcripts, in order to make sure that the bow is tied onto that gift that the school is going. So number one is making sure that you maintain that communication by regularly viewing that college portal to make sure that you're reviewing every single piece of documentation or information that's requested from you.
I'm glad that you brought up the transcripts. A lot of students are aware of the fact that their senior year grades in the second semester are not a factor in their admission process. But colleges always make their admission offers with the stipulation that students need to continue their successful academic career all the way through the end of that senior year. And so in order to verify that students have done so, they require a final transcript that certifies that you have essentially completed your requirements and have graduated high school and are ready to enroll in the fall. And we had students when I was working at Reed, there were always a handful of kids who didn't turn their transcript in and were not eligible to register for classes for the fall until that transcript was in the hands of an admission officer. That is not something you want to do when you are on campus.
Right.
It is something that you want to take care of while you are still a high school student, if at all possible to do so. So
Absolutely.
check that portal. Now, that communication is going to come from typically the admission office starts the communication, but I think that there are other college offices that will tend to take over from that point. Your prospect or applicant ID evolves into a student ID. Now you have kind of an identity within your college community. What are some other things that you think students ought to be looking out for, or parents ought to be looking out for heading into that fall?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the last piece, because this is mainly pertaining to parents, is that, okay, the student has this access to their portal. Okay. The parent isn't granted automatic access to that. And if the parent wants to keep track of bills and financial aid and grades and any other documentation, the student needs to make arrangement, whatever the reporting office is on campus, to grant the student their own access to that information.
That's right.
But it's not automatic.
Yeah, and it really changes, I think, the center of gravity from high school and from everything that you've done all through K-12, where the parent is the advocate for the student, over to the student now being in charge of their rights and responsibilities in terms of their education. We've talked about this in the past for students with disabilities or students with learning differences, that if you're going to advocate for some sort of an accommodation within your college setting, you need to be the one to do that, whereas your parent would have been the one to do that in the high school setting. So it is a pretty different shift. And how would you recommend that parents and students have this conversation, right? Like it's not just like, okay, now you're in charge, or let me see your grades, right? Like there's got to be a good way, I think, to maintain that balance, especially for a student that you're sending across the country 3,000 miles away. Any recommendations there?
No, I think that really that conversation does have to take place quite early on, because it's almost an establishment of respect. Yeah. Okay. In other words, students going away to college, mom and dad can't be on top of everything the whole time. And so perhaps the parents need to be the one to say, hey, look, I need access to this. I'm not going to be checking up on everything for you, but we need to be aware if there's any additional obligations that are coming down my way. Meaning, okay, we didn't borrow a full amount to pay for everything. We're participating in a payment plan, an interest-free payment plan to pay a portion of the tuition. If the notifications from the school are coming to they're for me, they're not for you. They're for the parent, not for the student, meaning.
Right.
And so I think there needs to be a laying out of expectations. And the parents are probably going to have to give a little bit more than they previously gave in high school. So something to be started sooner rather than later.
Yeah, you want those open lines of communication. I remember discovering pretty early on in my freshman year that I had a thing called a student account, and that when I went to the student bookstore in the middle of the night because I was hungry, I could just put stuff on my student account. But then I realized the end of the quarter that was going to my mom as a bill that she was getting from the bookstore with all the ice cream and stuff that I bought in the middle of the night. So, having those open lines of communication, I think is really important between students and parents, so that you can address minor things like a student account or major things like academic difficulties that students may be having.
Absolutely. And going along with that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but going along with that is in many schools' budgets or charges, they're including a health insurance cost. Mm-hmm. Okay. And for many schools, the students or the families actually have to opt out of that. So make sure that they're aware of if the school is front loading that account, that charge on there, and what they have to do to provide coverage information to the school in order to effectively opt out. Along those same medical lines is maybe even considering some legal guidance, because again, you're in the West Coast, kid goes to New York. What if a medical a medical issue happens?
Yeah.
Does the parent truly maintain, because of that distance or because of the school's responsibility, um, anything that guarantees their involvement with treatment or follow-up or anything like that? So a young adult power of attorney is probably not a bad thing to check into. And
Mhm.
I know we hope that we don't have to use these things. However, again, it's just better safe than sorry if you realize that you might be shut out in the care for your child.
It's a really great reminder. And I think not something that I remember ever thinking about when I went off to college. I don't think it's something that my parents and I talked about. There is a sense of invincibility at a particular age where it's like, I'm going to be fine. But things do come up, and there are unexpected events within a college campus. And I think just making sure that you have something that you don't need later on is better than needing something that you
Sure,
don't have.
sure,
So I
for
think
sure.
that's a great point. We've talked in the past with some of our finance colleagues around budgeting and helping students to get set up on a budget, and helping them to understand what the relationship is between a student and their entertainment budget, right? Going out with friends, seeing a movie. How should families start thinking about this kind of conversation? And do you have any recommendations for ways that they can get situated together?
Well, that's part of the conversation it needs to take back to happen earlier as well.
Yeah.
In a financial aid world, any financial aid that's dispersed to the student is going to be dispersed against the bill first. Okay. And
Mhm.
so there may be very rare cases where the student is getting a refund from that in order to fund their miscellaneous activities. Every student is going to spend something. So are the parents going to set up a budget in order to do that? Are they going to monitor? And this comes back down to the monitoring, to the sharing of information, to the establishing responsibilities. Are they going to work with the student to make sure that, just like in your case, okay, I'm going to the bookstore and we've got these invisible charges until maybe the end of the term? That can't be a surprise. And especially now, everything costs so much. And that if there is not going to be a refund from your institutional or other financial aid, there's going to have to be some support given from home, and parents need to work with families to try to establish good spending habits. There are some really nice apps for college age students that can help them budget, help them monitor, help the family set up a budget perhaps to make sure that the student goes into it. Uh, it's a new world for the student. It's you can't assume a level of maturity or responsibility. So hopefully the family's been building that in all along in order to make sure that you're not having something that's going to run amok.
Yeah, the new world point I think is really key. And as we were talking through this, I'm thinking about all of these different changes. How do I get around campus? If I'm at a big school, do I need a bicycle? If so, where do I get a bike? How do I make sure that it's locked up so that I don't need to get another bike at some point while I'm on campus?
Yeah, yeah,
How
yeah.
do I get around the city? I think a lot of students might think, well, I can take a lift if I have to get somewhere. I, have a ride share,
But
but
that
those
cost.
charges will add up fast. Is there some sort of public transportation? How
Right.
does that differ depending on what city that you belong to? So, there are so many different questions I think that are here. And
Absolutely.
one thing that you can do as a family is just sit down and think through, okay, what's my typical week going to look like? What's my weekend going to be? What might I like to do? And then how do I get myself situated so that I don't run into situations where my wallet is covering my lack of preparation in these circumstances? Right?
Hey, if I could add one more thing,
Please.
be aware of dates. Okay, you've got everything coming up. And again, you've just graduated from high school. You're trying to have fun this summer. When is freshman orientation?
Yeah.
Is freshman orientation going to be the only time to schedule courses? When is the start of classes? When are your holidays? When might you be able to go home? Be aware of dates. Don't let the calendar pass you by.
There's a lot of preparation I think that can be done in advance to think about, all right, I might want to come home for my first fall break just to, recharge and reset and see my family. And so can I get those plane tickets now if I
Right.
need to get them? Can I make that arrangement now?
Sure.
Am I looking for someone within the first couple of weeks of school who lives in the same town as I do or in the same area, and I can catch a ride home with them for a holiday
Absolutely.
break because we're in driving distance. So there's a lot of stuff I think to be thinking about. And, probably students are like, I just got to the end of all of this. Like, you're telling me that there's more to do, but there always is. But I think that there's smaller pieces, and it's something that we're recommending you really spread out over many conversations across the summer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anything else that we would recommend for folks as they get ready for the fall to arrive?
No, I think that we've run over quite a good bit of stuff. Again, this is not the time to go underground.
Yeah.
This is not the time to be unaware. You've got to be aware. You've got to make sure that you're covering your bases to ensure a smooth transition into what your new life is going to be for both students and families.
And it's a great reminder. I think students often figure when I get into college, that's the end, but it really is a beginning. And now you're off to the next adventure in your education, which is exciting, but it requires a great deal of preparation as well. So I think it's been a good conversation, Wally. I appreciate you coming on to have it with me.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. All right, folks, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the IB curriculum. So don't go away.